I try to keep these videos pretty short, 8 to 10 minutes usually, and it's just because I figure that if I speak on any subject for too long, it's going to get boring. However, there are some things that I simply can't cover in an 8 to 10 minute video that I couldn't cover in a 15 or 20-minute video. Some subjects are very complex, and you can really only just scratch the surface of them in 8 to 10 minutes. One of these subjects is Sam, the shot caller at San Quentin that I was talking about. He was a very interesting character, and even in an interesting situation, so I wanted to take the time and speak on him at greater length, because I think that understanding him can give you a mindset into how shot callers have to think in a prison, and even just give you a general insight into what the reception area, Badger section at San Quentin, was like. You see, I'd spent all morning before meeting Sam for the first time being processed through San Quentin. They do introductory medical tests, they go through your file, they have you speak to various officers, and what they're doing is they're trying to assess where in the prison you should be housed. Due to the amount of time that I was serving, they decided to place me in Badger section, which was restricted for new inmates into the system and returning inmates who had a lot of time to do, but who weren't going immediately to the SHU. So it's not quite the worst of the worst. Charles Manson wouldn't have been sent to Badger section. He would have been housed in isolation. But if you weren't going to be housed in isolation, and you were too much trouble to be anywhere else in the prison, Badger section is where they were going to send you. And you were going to be there for at least a couple of weeks, a month, maybe even 2, while they evaluated what prison you were going to be sent to. They walked me to the door that opens into the long hallway where all the cells are. And the officer just told me, okay, Channel, your bed is 248, so go up to the second tier and keep walking until you get to the end. Number 48, that's your cell. Close the door behind you, leave me alone, basically. I was lost and a little scared, honestly. I knew that I was in a nasty place, and this was the first time I hadn't had somebody walking with me telling me, go over there, do this. I climbed the stairs, and I've mentioned before how Sam saw me through a mirror that he was able to hold up like this, and he called me over and told me I needed to bring my paperwork. We spoke for a very short period of time, and then I walked along to my cell at the end of the tier, 248, 250 would be the last cell. I got to meet my new cellie, Egghead. If I'm being honest, I didn't particularly like him, but I didn't dislike him either. I was just happy that I hadn't moved in with some monstrous 350-pound angry guy who said he was going to assault me the minute I walked in the door. That had been my quiet fear. Egghead looked a little bit like George Costanza on Seinfeld. He was middle-aged, he was short, he was balding, he even had kind of an annoying laugh and demeanor to him. He explained that he was in on a drug case. He'd gotten caught with some meth and a weapon, and that he was going to have to do a couple of years in prison. He was appalled that he'd been sent to Badger section. He'd been in prison before, and he'd really expected to be in some kind of low-security wing. I didn't know I was supposed to ask to look at his paperwork. I didn't know that was a commonly done thing, and he didn't ask to look at mine, so I just kind of settled in. This was all before the 1700 count. They count all of the inmates in the entire state at 5 p.m. So right before the count, the cop comes and locks every door and makes sure that it's locked, and then he goes back again and he writes down all the inmates that are missing so that he knows how many are on the tier. This is called a negative count. If there are 100 beds on the tier and he writes down 2 inmates aren't on their beds for whatever reason, then he knows that there were a total of 98 inmates on the tier. After they finish the count in the entire state and the right number of inmates are there so they can open up the doors again, immediately when the doors were opened, big corn-fed white boy. I said the 350-pound monstrosity. Irish was 300 of those 350 pounds at least. He was a big old dude. And just to be clear, there are a couple of big guys named Irish that got a little famous in the system, prison politics and all that. He wasn't any of these guys, to the best of my knowledge. Yes, I knew a big white guy named Irish, and no, I don't believe he ever went anywhere. He had a pair of boots for me, right off the gate. He said, "Hey, you're Aaron, here's a pair of boots. Sam said that I got to get them to you because we can't have you walking around in those jack flaps. If something kicks off, you got to be ready." I was grateful. This was awesome. A pair of boots, that could be life or death type of thing, you know? I mean, the jack flaps were hard to move around in. You fell over easily. Boots gave you traction. I immediately started trying to put them on while they were getting ready to run dinner for our wing. As I was putting them on, my silly egghead muttered, and mind you, he muttered to me. He did not mutter to Irish. In fact, I don't think he said a word to Irish. He muttered, "I've been waiting for 3 days since I got here. Nobody's gotten me a pair of boots. I'm still wearing these damn jack flaps." I picked up a little bit about the dynamic that was going on, and it made me uncomfortable quick. It was obvious that Irish had a problem with Egghead. I didn't give it much thought. Honestly, I decided to ignore the issue. Not my problem, just keep your head down, you'll be alright, is what I told myself. Put on my boots, and I walked with Irish and Egghead to dinner. Because they'd waited so long for me to put on my boots, we were the last 3 guys to make it into the chow hall, and we ended up sitting at a table by ourselves. We went back to the cell after dinner, and pretty much just settled. Nothing unusual happened until that night, whenever they were turning out the lights at 10 p.m. You have every ethnicity yells down the tier and does something called roll call. This is something, if you've done time, you know what the roll call is, and if you haven't done time, it's going to sound a little strange. The shot caller, the guy who has the keys for the building, for every single race, yells out his tier, "Hey, cell 10 whatever, are you guys okay down there?" And they answer back. So in this instance, whenever it was my turn, Sam called out, "Hey, cell 248, white man, you alright down there, Aaron?" And because I'd been listening to what every single other person in the 200 cells had said to their representative, the shot caller for their race, I knew to yell back, "Hey, this is 248, it's Aaron, I'm alright. Respect to you, white man. Good night, Sam." This is purportedly in order to check to make sure that nobody has died over the course of the time from dinner. You do every inmate calls to his shot caller and lets him know everything's alright. You'll notice something very important. Egghead was left out of the roll call. I didn't think of it at the time, but in retrospect it was a giant red flag. The next morning, they did roll call for breakfast, and we walked to breakfast, and it was basically the same thing as walking to dinner. There were no real changes, except that Irish pulled me aside at breakfast and told me, "Hey, don't come out to yard today. I know that today's your first yard, and you're supposed to come out and bring your paperwork, but me and Sam talked about it, we want you to stay in today. We'll talk to you later." I didn't argue the point. I knew something was up, but I figured keep your head down, do what you're told. That yard, Egghead got smashed. He'd actually taken a book out to the yard and sat down in a shady corner of the concrete yard where everybody was doing their calisthenics to read. A white guy who'd been looking to make his name ran up on him and kicked him in the face hard, and he was out like a light, and he put boots to him until the cops got there. It wasn't long, probably 30, 45 seconds. This was a concrete yard. The cops were on things. Later on, Sam and Irish explained to me that this guy had had 4 days to bring out his paperwork. It had been alleged that he'd been a sex offender, and he'd refused to bring out his paperwork. So, he got smashed. And that's the way they do things on these concrete yards. It's the way they do things at reception. With one little caveat. Usually, you would have 2 weeks, 3 weeks, even a month to bring in your paperwork, because it can be hard to get that kind of thing. You have to contact your lawyer, you have to contact your family. 4 days is absurdly abrupt. In retrospect, it makes sense to me. Sam was trying to run a tight program. He was trying to get a name for himself, and whenever somebody who looks like George Costanza that nobody likes walks on the tier, maybe he was a sex offender. I honestly don't know. I'm not saying he was or wasn't. I'm saying that if you're trying to get a reputation for somebody who just smashes creeps the minute they walk on the yard, He was a great target. Egghead just looked the part. That was my first 2 days in a reception center, and it was my first experience with Sam and with inmate politics. Something that stands out to me is that Irish and Sam made sure that I didn't come out to the concrete yard. Pulled me aside. They could have just let me come out. I mean, this is prison. You're expected to see people get hurt. But Sam was planning ahead. He knew that I might have some kind of loyalty to my new cellmate. I'd only been on the yard for 1 day, and if I jumped to try and protect him, that would have made it so that 2 people ended up getting rolled off the yard instead of just 1. It was planning on his part, the same as getting the boots for me. It was planning on his part. He was taking me and using me as a resource so that he could be more effective as a general. I didn't mind. I wanted the boots. I needed the boots. They could have saved my life. But it was the first time that I'd had somebody else evaluate my potential as a soldier in their army, essentially. I learned a lesson from Sam that day. We'll call it a lesson from a shot caller. A small gift, a nothing gift in the right circumstances, like a used pair of boots, they can buy loyalty really cheap. It didn't occur to me that there was an ulterior motive to those boots, and I was on Sam's side after he got them for me, even though I didn't know anything about the situation.